In 2025, a new kind of love test swept through parts of Asia and Africa, not the kind found in magazines or late-night television, but a clinical, data-driven screening, full-spectrum genetic compatibility testing, promoted as a way to prevent heartbreak, hereditary illness, and even future divorce. It promised couples a scientifically approved stamp of approval before marriage. In this new landscape, where a strand of DNA could override emotion, millions began to trust machines over intuition. But what happens when love contradicts the data? Tariq was no stranger to the power of genes. At 34, he was a rising star in genetic research, specializing in the very mutations that had once shattered his world. As a child, he watched his younger sister waste away from a cruel recessive disorder, a disease no one in the family knew they carried until it was too late. The guilt and helplessness that followed never truly left him. Science, for Tariq, became both escape and redemption. If he could decode the genome, maybe he could control the pain. Then came Amina, radiant, uncompromising, full of conviction, the daughter of a conservative but educated family who believed in progress as long as it came with safeguards. When their relationship grew serious, her family insisted on a full genetic compatibility test. Amina complied. Tariq, torn between honesty and fear, hesitated. The results revealed the truth. He carried the same dangerous mutation that once destroyed his sister. Amina's genome made their pairing high risk. He knew what that meant. Her parents would end it. Maybe she would too. But Tariq also knew else how to manipulate data. It was easy, almost too easy, for someone like him to quietly edit a few lines in the report. The mutation vanished. The risk disappeared. Love, it seemed, had won. They married, full of joy, unaware of the secret coded into their child's future. A year later, the scream of a monitor in a neonatal unit shattered the illusion. Their baby, barely a few weeks old, was diagnosed with the very disease Tariq thought he'd buried in the past. It wasn't just a genetic failure. It was a human one, a betrayal not only of trust, but of the very science he'd built his life upon. Now, haunted by the consequences, Tariq faces a question more complicated than any genome. When we have the power to rewrite reality, what do we owe to the truth, the promise and peril of genetic destiny? For as long as humans have walked the earth, we have been trying to understand why traits both desirable and devastating seem to run in families. The story of genetic screening begins not in a laboratory, but in the garden of an Austrian monk named Gregor Mendel. Through meticulous experiments on pea plants in the mid-1800s, Mendel uncovered the laws of inheritance, predictable patterns through which traits like flower, color, and seed shape were passed down through generations. Though his work was largely ignored during his lifetime, it laid the foundation for a revolution in biology, one that would grow from curiosity about plant breeding to a profound reshaping of how we understand ourselves. In the 20th century, Mendel's rediscovered laws began to inform the science of human heredity. Early geneticists mapped the inheritance of diseases like hemophilia and Tay-Sachs, illuminating for the first time how invisible mutations could cascade through generations. By the 1990s, the sequencing of the human genome, the complete blueprint of our DNA, ushered in a new era of precision. Genes once thought mysterious became decipherable. Tests could now identify mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes, which significantly increased a woman's risk of breast and ovarian cancer. These medical breakthroughs were no longer about probability, they were about prediction. But the story didn't stop there. As genetic technologies evolved, so did their reach. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA democratized genomics, offering consumers the chance to trace ancestry, discover long-lost relatives, or assess risk for dozens of conditions, all with a saliva sample. Meanwhile, the development of CRISPR, a gene editing technology likened to a pair of molecular scissors, raised the possibility not just of reading DNA but rewriting it. Polygenic risk scores, a method of aggregating tiny effects from hundreds or thousands of genetic variants, emerged to predict complex traits, from intelligence to mental health disorders. Suddenly, the conversation had shifted. Genes were no longer just about identity or disease, but about potential. This explosion in genetic capability didn't unfold in a vacuum. Around the world, societies began integrating genomics into their cultural and moral frameworks. Nowhere is this more visible than in the domain of marriage and reproduction. In countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and parts of South Asia, Genetic screening is often a routine part of premarital matchmaking, especially in populations with high rates of consanguinity marriages between close relatives that amplify the risk of recessive genetic disorders. These tests are marketed as tools for ensuring healthier families, helping couples avoid devastating inherited diseases. The logic is persuasive. If both partners are carriers of the same harmful mutation, their children have a 25% chance of being affected. Why not test before commitment? What once might have seemed invasive is now considered responsible. In some cultures, genetic compatibility is seen as equally important as religion, education, or caste. A growing industry of DNA-based matchmaking has emerged, with companies claiming to use genomics to determine biological compatibility. Yet this also raises uncomfortable questions. What happens when genetic data clashes with deep-rooted values of family honor, marital obligation, and community legacy? Is love negotiable in the face of a high-risk genome? Or does data simply become another layer in the already complex web of marriage negotiations? These questions are not hypothetical. For families like Amina's, they are deeply personal, educated, cautious, and profoundly shaped by the past. Her family lives under the shadow of genetic trauma. One branch of their lineage was nearly destroyed by a recessive condition, a cruel, invisible inheritance that struck without warning. It devastated not only the child it afflicted, but the extended family who carried the guilt of having passed it on unknowingly. That tragedy left scars. From that moment on, the family became vigilant, almost scientific, about their approach to marriage and reproduction. Science wasn't something abstract, it was protection, a shield against repeating history. And yet, even as they embraced genetic screening, they also wrestled with its implications. The coldness of risk calculation, the reduction of life to percentages, and the anxiety of knowing too much. In Amina's world, tradition and technology exist side by side, sometimes in harmony, often in tension. The promises of modern genomics offer a sense of control over fate, a way to rewrite a painful family legacy. But at what cost? As society rushes forward into an age of personalized genetics, the line between prevention and discrimination, love and logic, destiny and choice, grows ever thinner. And for families like hers, each decision carries the weight of the past and the burden of the future. A baby is born, and so is the truth. It began with small things, subtle signs that something was wrong. The baby, Lena, once so bright and alert, began to miss developmental milestones. Her limbs grew stiff, her reactions dulled, and a strange weakness seemed to settle into her tiny frame. At first, doctors were cautious, unwilling to raise alarm, but Amina knew something wasn't right. She had done everything by the book: the prenatal screenings, the blood tests, the early interventions, and yet, here they were, weeks turning into months, and the worry deepening. Eventually, the neurologist ordered a full genetic panel. When the results came back, they hit like a tsunami. Lena had Tay Sachs disease, a rare, fatal recessive disorder that gradually destroys nerve cells in the brain and spinal cord. There was no cure, no treatment, only a devastating prognosis: seizures, paralysis, and early death, often before the age of 4. The room went silent as the diagnosis was explained. Amina sat frozen, unable to comprehend how such a fate had reached her daughter, her carefully planned, deeply wanted child. The shock quickly gave way to confusion. Amina was a known carrier of the Tay Sachs mutation. She had been tested years ago as part of the family's premarital genetic screening process. But she remembered clearly, Tariq, her husband, had been tested too. He had shown her the certificate. Negative, it had said. Not a carrier. The doctors reassured her, back then reassured both families, that they were genetically compatible, that the chances of passing on a lethal condition were negligible. So how, she now asked, could this have happened? The silence that followed was heavier than any words. At first, Tariq deflected. He claimed the lab had made a mistake, that the report was wrong, that maybe his results had been confused with someone else's. But the more questions Amina asked, the less convincing his answers became. Finally, under mounting pressure from both sides of the family and medical professionals, Tariq broke down. He hadn't been tested properly. He hadn't wanted to risk rejection, hadn't wanted to deal with the shame that would follow a positive result in a culture where marriage prospects are so delicately balanced on health, status, and genetics. So, he admitted, he had obtained, a friend's reports, someone who wasn't to carry on, passed it off as his own. The confession detonated through the family like a bomb. Trust wasn't just broken, it was obliterated. Amina, crushed by grief and rage, couldn't look at him. Her parents, who had once welcomed Tariq with open arms, now refused to speak. His name, his own family, was stunned, caught between defending their son and reckoning with his deceit. Medical professionals were equally shaken, both by the emotional devastation and by the unsettling implications. How could a lie so simple, so easy to commit, result in a consequence so irreversible? As the emotional wreckage unfolded, deeper questions began to rise. Could someone be held legally accountable for falsifying genetic data? Was there a legal precedent for prosecuting a person whose lie directly led to the birth of a child with a preventable genetic disease? Bioethicists were consulted. Lawyers argued over informed consent, medical fraud, and reproductive rights. Some pointed to parallels in cases involving HIV status or concealed medical histories. Others warned of the dangers in criminalizing reproduction, in setting a legal standard for honesty in intimate relationships. The law, it seemed, was not prepared for a world where lies could be written in DNA. And then there was the moral weight. What kind of person gambles with the life of a future child? What does it mean to choose ignorance or worse, to engineer deception for the sake of love, pride, or convenience? In the quietest moments, these were the questions Amina sat with, as Lena lay in her crib surrounded by machines and silence. Science had given them the tools to see the future, but no tool could force someone to face it. In the end, it wasn't a mutation that had brought tragedy into their lives. It was a choice made in fear, concealed in selfishness, and paid for in innocence. Asterisk, asterisk, what is a lie in the age of DNA? Asterisk, asterisk, in the weeks that followed Lena's diagnosis and Tariq's confession, Amina found herself trapped in a labyrinth of questions, not just about her future or her marriage, but about the very nature of truth. In an age where science could peer into the deepest layers of the human blueprint, the initial fury, righteous and volcanic, had begun to evolve into something stranger, more unsettling. She still felt betrayed, still mourned the life her daughter would never live. But as the storm of emotions gave way to reflection, the lines that once seemed clear began to blur. From a legal standpoint, the case was a black hole. Lawyers and ethicists scrambled to find precedents, but the truth was stark. No existing law directly prohibited what Tariq had done. There were statutes against fraud, yes, and informed consent frameworks in medicine, but those were built for financial contracts or surgical procedures, not for the intimate. Informal trust exchanged between two people pledging to build a life and family together. Tariq hadn't lied on a government document, hadn't committed insurance fraud, hadn't harmed Amina directly, yet the consequences of his deception were profound: genetic, generational, irreversible, and the law, for all its procedural elegance, wasn't built to answer whether lying about your genome should be a crime. Even morality offered no clean verdict. Had Tariq acted out of cowardice or desperation? Was his decision rooted in selfish love, a refusal to lose Aminor, selfless hope that the worst wouldn't happen? Some even questioned whether his actions were so different from couples who knowingly married despite shared carrier status, accepting the risks out of love, faith, or fatalism. Others wondered if his real sin wasn't in avoiding the truth, but in editing, curating his own genetic identity to fit a socially acceptable mold. It raised a chilling thought. In a world of genetic data, was truth now negotiable? Was the crime in what he did, or in how well he concealed it? The past offered eerie parallels. A century earlier, eugenics had emerged from scientific curiosity, and quickly metastasized into social policy, driven by a desire to purify the human gene pool. In the early 20th century, countries like the United States and Germany had sterilized thousands deemed genetically unfit. Later, in the 1980s and 90s, IVF technology introduced the idea of choosing embryo screening for diseases, yes, but also for sex, eye color, and eventually intelligence. What began as a quest to prevent suffering had often slipped into something else: control, perfectionism, the commodification of life itself. Tariq's lie wasn't born in a vacuum. It echoed these histories, these dark ambitions, these attempts to master destiny. Real-world cases began to emerge as there were lawsuits where sperm donors had misrepresented their medical or psychological histories, resulting in children born with devastating illnesses. courts had struggled to assign blame. Was the harm to the mother, the child, or society at large? Other cases involved HIV-positive partners who had failed to disclose their status. These had clearer legal ramifications, but even they were fraught with complexity: intent, transmission, consent. Still, none of these perfectly matched Tariq's case. His lie wasn't about hiding illness. It was about avoiding the possibility of one. He hadn't broken a law, he had broken trust. But in the world they now lived in, wasn't that enough? And then there was Amina's own conflict, which deepened in silence. She kept replaying the what-ifs. If Lena had never shown symptoms, if she had lived a long, healthy life, would the lie have mattered at all? Would it have remained buried, a quiet detail in an otherwise happy story? Was knowledge always better than ignorance? Or did knowing the truth only matter because the outcome had been tragic? And if so, was her outrage born of moral clarity or retrospective pain? Outside the family's home, the story had leaked. It first appeared on a medical ethics blog, then was picked up by a local journalist, and from there exploded across social media. The reactions were swift and polarized. Some commentators cast Tariq as a villain, an emblem of toxic masculinity, selfish deception, and the dangers of misusing science. Others, more sympathetic, painted him as a tragic figure, a man trapped between love and genetics, victimized by a system that treated DNA like a caste system. In some circles, especially among young couples facing similar genetic screenings, his story sparked unease. Was he really so different from them? The debate took on a life of its own. Online forums erupted, memes circulated, bioethicists were interviewed, even political pundits began to weigh in, linking the controversy to broader concerns about reproductive rights, genetic privacy, and state overreach. And all the while, Amina remained at the center of a storm. She never asked for grieving a child, questioning a marriage, and carrying the unbearable weight of a single question that echoed louder with each passing day. In a world where the code of life can be read like a contract, what does it mean to lie? The lie wasn't the first one. Just as Amina began to piece together the wreckage of her trust, of her daughter's future, of her marriage, a deeper fracture began to reveal itself, one not born in betrayal between husband and wife, but embedded in the very institutions they had trusted to protect them. The turning point came quietly, almost by accident. In searching through old medical records, seeking clarity, Amina discovered inconsistencies, subtle, buried lines in the family's genetic reports that didn't quite add up. When she pressed her cousin, a genetics postgraduate student who had long worked part-time with the same screening service her family had used, the truth began to surface hesitantly, then torrentially. The genetic screening company, recommended by their community, considered reputable and family-friendly, had for years been engaged in a quiet but calculated manipulation of test results. Risk indicators were selectively disclosed or softened, particularly when the families involved were considered high-status or well-connected. In some cases, borderline mutations were reclassified as benign to avoid disrupting proposed marriages. Behind the scenes, data was interpreted not through the lens of strict science, but through social convenience and cultural pressure. The system hadn't failed Amina. It had functioned exactly as designed. She wasn't the only one. Another child, this time a distant cousin, had been born with a similarly devastating condition a few years earlier. But the family had covered it up. The diagnosis had been quietly absorbed, the child institutionalized, the genetic narrative altered to preserve marriage prospects for siblings. The story had been buried, swallowed by shame and secrecy. Now, as Amina stared at her own daughter's diminishing future, she saw it clearly. This wasn't just about Tariq's lie. This was a culture of lies wrapped in science, sold as safety, and passed off as destiny. What emerged next was even more staggering. The entire industry of DNA-based matchmaking, glorified in glossy brochures and parent WhatsApp groups, was built on sand. The promise of certainty was nothing more than marketing. The data behind polygenic scores, used to predict complex traits like intelligence, compatibility, or risk tolerance, was still in its infancy, statistically shaky, ethically ambiguous, and wildly susceptible to interpretation. Rare mutations, gene-environment interactions, epigenetic factors, none of these could be cleanly accounted for. Yet companies continued to present genetic compatibility as an objective truth, a formula for ideal unions. In reality, biology was chaos dressed in code, and the fantasy they had been sold was one of control over an inherently unpredictable system. The twist was cruel. Tariq's individual lie, though reckless and damaging, had been part of a much larger illusion. He had deceived Amina, but they had both been deceived by the system. Armed with this realization, and seeking some form of redemption, Tariq did something no one expected. He turned whistleblower, digging through old emails, forms, and communications from his own screening process. Tariq uncovered internal memos that suggested collusion between counselors and families, urging flexibility in reporting certain carrier statuses. Some notes even implied quotas pressure to ensure that screening didn't lead to too many cancelled engagements, lest business suffer. One counselor even wrote, "Don't frighten them. Focus on the positive." It was all there, subtle, coded, damning. Tariq published it all in a raw, painful, and unflinching essay posted online. He detailed his own deception, yes, but also the deeper one. He admitted his guilt, his cowardice, and his regret. But he also named the culture that had groomed him to believe that the truth could be bent for love, and that data could be managed like reputation. The post went viral overnight. Some saw him as finally courageous, others as seeking absolution too late. But few could ignore the deeper questions now surging into public debate. Who owns genetic truth? Who decides what's worth knowing, and what's worth hiding? As headlines swirled and policy committees scrambled to investigate the industry, Amina stood in the quiet aftermath of the storm. She no longer saw herself simply as a victim of one man's lie, but as the inheritor of a system of half-truths, white lies, and genetic optimism spun far beyond the limits of what science could honestly guarantee. Lena's illness had revealed not just the fragility of the human body, but the fragility of the stories we build around it, stories of control, of certainty, of future-proof families. In the end, the greatest lie wasn't Tariq's. It was the belief that genes alone could protect them from chaos. Asterisk, asterisk, what science can and can't promise, asterisk, asterisk. In the months that followed Tariq's public reckoning, and the viral shockwave that his essay unleashed, a quiet transformation began, one that unfolded not only in policy rooms and hospitals, but also within the fragile space of a family learning how to live with both loss and the flicker of hope. Lena, once thought to be on a tragic and irreversible path, became eligible for an experimental gene therapy trial being conducted abroad. It was still early stage, full of risks and unknowns, but it offered something they hadn't allowed themselves to feel in a long time: possibility. Through an intricate procedure, the missing enzyme her body couldn't produce would be delivered using a modified virus, designed to carry a corrected version of the faulty gene into her cells. The therapy was not a miracle. There were setbacks, side effects, terrifying days in intensive care, but over time, small improvements began to emerge. Her motor functions stabilized, her seizures reduced, and most importantly, the degeneration slowed. The doctors were cautious, never promising a cure, but for Amina it was enough that her daughter had a chance at something close to life. Every gain felt like defiance, not just against the disease, but against the illusion that destiny, once written in DNA, was unchangeable. For Amina and Tariq, however, the damage done to their relationship could not be reversed. Their trust, once whole and unspoken, had been dismantled too thoroughly to be rebuilt. Amina made the decision to separate. There were no angry public declarations, no scorched earth divorces, just a quiet, respectful parting. They became co-parents, bound forever by their daughter, by shared grief, and by a deeper, more complicated understanding of one another. Tariq, barred from working in the genetic counseling space due to professional misconduct, took a different path, consulting on ethics reform and speaking to young men and couples about the consequences of silence, fear, and trying to cheat the system outside their private lives. The public consequences of the case were unfolding with increasing speed. A wave of national debate had erupted over the regulation of genetic screening services, especially those used for marriage matchmaking. Lawmakers introduced preliminary guidelines on informed consent, third-party result verification, and the psychological risks of sharing complex genetic data with untrained individuals. Grassroots organizations demanded that polygenic risk scores be labeled with clearer disclaimers. Others called for licensing requirements for matchmaking. Platforms that used genomic data insisting that science be safeguarded from misuse by commercial or cultural pressures. Amidst the media frenzy, Amina sat down with several leading determined to understand deeply and honestly what the science actually said, and what it still couldn't. One expert explained that while monogenic diseases like Tay-Sachs, can often be traced to single mutations. The vast majority of traits people seek to predict mental health conditions, intelligence, compatibility are influenced by thousands of genetic variants interacting with lifestyle, environment, and sheer randomness. Polygenic scores, he said plainly, are not crystal balls. They can nudge our understanding, he told her, but they can't write your future. Anyone who says otherwise is either selling something or lying. Another scientist emphasized the psychological and social danger of overestimating genetic determinism. When DNA becomes fate, he warned, people begin to see themselves and each other as fixed quantities. We reduce love to risk scores, identity to ancestry charts, and children to projected traits. It's not science. It's genetic astrology in a lab coat. What science can offer, they agreed, is guidance, not prophecy. It can flag risk, but not certainty. It can suggest likelihoods, but not guarantees. And when misused, it becomes not a tool of empowerment, but of control. In this new clarity, Amina found a strange kind of peace, not in the illusion that everything would be okay, but in the deeper truth that life, like genes, is neither fully predictable nor fully controllable. There will always be mutations we cannot see, outcomes we cannot forecast, and decisions made in the gray zones between love, fear, and hope. Lena's condition had been triggered by a lie, but her future, fragile and unfolding, was now being shaped by honesty, science, and the radical courage to face uncertainty. As the public discourse continued, and regulatory frameworks began to take shape, Amina knew that her story and her daughters would become part of a larger reckoning. A generation raised on the promise of genetic mastery was now learning to live with its limits. The fantasy of certainty had cracked. What remained was more humble, more human, imperfect knowledge, shared responsibility, and the enduring truth that no one's future can or should be written in stone. In the quiet, after everything, after the scandal, after the trial, after the experiment of hope, Tariq no longer spoke as a father trying to save his child, or as a scientist trying to outwit nature. He spoke as a man who had seen how deeply we wish to control what cannot be controlled. His final words, written in a guest editorial no major journal dared to publish, rippled through a few corners of the web like a whisper from the edge of the future. Greater than genes are not destiny. Greater than truth is not code. And love should never be a lie, especially the ones we tell ourselves. There was no dramatic reckoning, no cinematic redemption. The world moved on. Amina raised their child, still fragile, still uncertain, with a quiet dignity. Tariq, no longer allowed to practice, became a reluctant symbol for a question society wasn't quite ready to ask. What happens to humanity when we start editing the very roots of what makes us who we are? We live in a time where everything can be measured, personality traits scored, dating matched by algorithms, embryos selected for health, intelligence, height. Even grief has metrics now. It's efficient, it's clean. But in that cleanliness, something essential feels like it's slipping through our fingers. What if the things we can't quantify, intuition, failure, randomness, irrational love, are exactly what make us human? The story of Tariq and his family was never really about genetics. It was about our fear of chaos, our obsession with perfection, and our willingness to deceive ourselves in the name of love. They tried to build a future with better code, but no amount of precision could erase the messy, beautiful imperfection of the human heart. And so the question remains, in a world where every part of life can be optimized and edited, will we still know what it means to be human? Maybe we'll only realize what we've lost when we stop hearing that quiet, inexplicable pull toward each other, not because of data, but despite it.